So I see there's some stuff inside. What else you got? I see raisins and maybe a little bit of peel. So just stuff everything.
There's raisins and peel, although
it doesn't look like there's any in that one. But not in that one.
Welcome friends, welcome back to the kitchen. Welcome back to Sunday morning in the old cookbook show. Today we're going to do a recipe out of this little cookbook, little pamphlet, presented by Robin Hood Flour Mills Limited Cooking School, featuring Rita Martin recipes. This is sometime in the 1950s, I think, based on the types of recipes that are in here, the language used. And it features, Rita Martin recipes. Now, Rita Martin, not a real person. Not a real person. She is from a long line of not real people used to sell consumer products. Robin Hood Flour Mills comes up with Rita Martin sometime in the 1920s, I think, and they start promoting her as a guru of baking, and they used her into the late 60s or early 70s. She never had to age. She could change with the times. The background people could completely change with the times and always produce more recipes that made consumers buy more flour. Fake person. And I thought I'd do this one because this is the first time in ages I've actually had Robin Hood flour in the house. It was on sale, so I bought some. And we're going to make a recipe. That touches on a couple of interesting points that I want to make about baking bread. And you're probably going to hear me talk about this a few times over the next little while, because I just baked that loaf of bread for this soup recipe. We're going to make this sweet dough, refrigerator sweet dough, and then in a couple of weeks we're going to do something out of a Fleischmann recipe book that follows sort of the same pattern. This idea that you make a basic or a master dough, and then you come along later and cut off little bits and make it into a dozen or more different things. The recipe book from Fleischmann, I think they have like 75 different recipes that you can make from this master dough. This book doesn't give as many recipes to make from the master dough, but it gives you a bunch of different options. So, water, warm water, in the bottom of that bowl. Now, we need to proof the yeast. I'm using a dry yeast, traditional dry yeast, active dry yeast. And so, calls for 1 packet of dry yeast. So that's 2¼ teaspoons of active dry. I've cut the recipe in half because I didn't need a ball of dough from 8 cups of flour. So I've only got 4 cups of flour to make this. Now I say this step, blooming, isn't strictly necessary. I need to take a teaspoon of the sugar from later in the recipe and put it in here. I often use now a Fleischmann yeast called Rapid Rise, and it's a much smaller granule than you get in this one. And you just put it directly into the flour. And they actually recommend with the Rapid Rise, like right on the label, don't do this step. Just throw it right in the flour and go. As long as your yeast hasn't expired, the expiry date on the yeast. If the yeast has expired, it's probably still okay. I shouldn't say that, but it probably still is okay. It just takes a little longer to get going, that's all. So we're going to let this prove. While the yeast is proving, I'm going to beat this egg. Okay, so the yeast hasn't puffed up yet. It hasn't proved, but I can smell it. It's active. It's working. I know that it's okay because I just baked this loaf of bread. And that loaf of bread is an example of another bread formula of the ratio of flour to water to yeast to salt, that depending on how I treat it, I end up with 4 different loaves of bread. Well, actually 3 loaves of bread and a pizza crust, depending on how I treat the dough along the way. Need to add the egg, the rest of our sugar, salt, another cup of warm water, and half of the flour. And I'll just use a spoon at this point to mix this part together. Okay, sticky, gloopy mass. Looks really good. Next in is shortening. I'm using butter. Butter is a shortening. There would be a case to be made in the 1950s that probably a lot of people might have used vegetable shortening. I think for an enriched dough that we're going to make a sweet bun out of, butter is the way to go. Butter is the shortening to use. But, you know, by all means, you could use lard if you wanted to, or vegetable shortening if that's your thing. And then we mix in the rest of the flour. And at some point, I'll give up on the spoon and I'll get in there with my hands. Okay, I think it's time to get in there with my fingers and do the rest. And we'll bring this dough together. We'll get all the flour incorporated. Okay, out on the bench, I'm not going to put any flour out. This seems like it's going to be a relatively dry dough. It's not going to be very sticky. So the idea here is that you're going to make this dough on a Saturday or Sunday, or a day when you've got some time. Then you're going to stick it in the fridge, and you're going to forget about it until the next day. The next day, you're going to open up the fridge. You're going to take a little piece of the dough out, enough for a few buns for that day's meal or the next morning's breakfast. You're going to punch down the dough that's remaining. You're going to cover it back up and put it back in the fridge. And you're going to do that over the course of the entire week. They say 5 or 6 days. This dough is good in the fridge. And I would pretty much support that. The dough is coming together. It's kneading together. It is a little bit dry. I would probably, if I made this again, add a little bit more water. There is a note at the bottom that if you're using it for sweet rolls, you could use milk. Milk would certainly make this a much richer dough. I think, and so here's where you get into, this is a 1950s cookbook. Even though I'm still using Robin Hood flour today, and that's who made this book, the flour that they're producing today is different than they did in the 1950s. It would be, you know, different protein levels. It would come from different types of wheat. Milling practices could have changed a little bit in terms of how fine they're milling and so on and so forth. It's hard to tell with that sort of thing, but you do have to make something like this the first time and then figure out what adjustments you're going to make. Because as I've said over and over and over again, as much as baking, and especially bread, is a science, because there's a whole lot of science happening inside this dough. There's yeast enzymatic action. There's complex chains of sugars being broken down so the yeast can eat it. They're throwing off alcohols and carbon dioxide. They're also doing other things to help the gluten along. And we've got gluten structure forming from proteins. This is super scientific. But the art of making a loaf of bread out of it or buns out of it, that's an art. That is definitely an art. So it's one of those things where you make it once and you go, okay, I'm going to make a notation here that based on the brand of flour I'm using, I need to use a little bit more water. What I'm going to do is just form this into a ball. This bowl has been greased with a little bit of butter, so I'm going to coat it with the butter, put a lid on it, and I'm going to let it rise for an hour and a half, is what it says here. Actually, 1 3/4 hours. And then we're going to come back and we're going to make bath buns. So I'm going to get the rest of the ingredients together to make the bath buns out of this. Oven is preheating. I'm going to have some lunch. I'll see you in a little bit. Okay, full disclosure, it's a week later. I got called away and I couldn't finish the dough that you just saw me make on camera. So I baked it off camera and I made these buns, and Julie and I have been eating them for breakfast. These are really stale now, but I saved a couple so that you could see them. I don't remember exactly what I said during the video that I shot a week ago, but I found this dough to be, the hydration level to be too low. It was a very dry dough, a very stiff dough, very hard to work. And when I look at my cookbooks from the 1700s and the 1800s, the bread doughs in those books are a much higher hydration. So there's more water to any given amount of flour. And I've got a few theories about how between that time period and the early 1900s into the 1940s, the hydration level dropped, giving you a much drier dough. And it's not fully proven, just thoughts in my head that I have yet to really fully formulate. But I'll throw them out there and we can discuss them. In the 1700s and 1800s, most people who were making bread at home were using liquid yeast. They'd go to a brewery, or they were brewing beer at home, they were brewing beer in their house. They would capture the barm off the top of the beer, so the yeast that had come to the top. They would keep it alive in their kitchen in a jug. They would boil potatoes until the potatoes disintegrated, and then they would use that liquid to feed the yeast. So they'd put the yeast into the water with the boiled potatoes and stuff. They'd also throw in some hops. The yeast would eat the nutrients from the potatoes. The hops would keep it from going sour because they didn't want sour. They didn't want sourdough. They wanted fresh tasting yeast for their bread. And then they would scoop out a cup of that liquid to use it in their dough, leading to higher hydration. And when people switched to yeast cakes or dry yeast, that liquid disappeared. And I think that it wasn't fully compensated for, and it lowered the hydration level. That's one of my theories. The other theory is that by the time you get to 1900 and into the 1940s, fewer and fewer and fewer people are making bread at home on a regular basis. They're buying it at the bakery, they're buying it at the grocery store. They're not making it at home as often. And so when these recipes show up in these consumer cookbooks, they're lower hydration, giving a drier dough because people weren't as accustomed to dealing with a sticky, high hydration dough. And they'd put flour down. They'd put flour down everywhere because people don't like it when it sticks to their hand. They don't like it when it sticks to the bench. I see it in all kinds of recipes to flour the bench, which just makes it even drier. To me, a dry dough doesn't work. So when I got to this point, I said, okay, I need to remake the dough to finish the video. I'm not going to use the same hydration level that's in the cookbook. So I made it again, and I increased the liquid, and I made some cinnamon buns. Much better texture than that set. I made it again and made a Chelsea adjacent bun. We'll call it a Brompton bun, Chelsea adjacent. Higher hydration yet again, much nicer dough to work with, to me anyway. A little bit sticky, kind of stuck to the counter, but that's fine. You get used to it, and it gives a much better product. And then for this dough that I made yesterday that we're going to work with now, I increased the hydration even more, and I used milk instead of water, and I think I've got a really good looking dough. So this had been in the fridge overnight. You see it's sticky, all right? It's sticky. Been in the fridge overnight, and I've pulled it out. It's been out a couple hours now. It's just coming up to room temperature. And it's sticky and it's pliable, but I think this is going to be a much better dough. Okay, so I'm going to get this out on the bench. We're going to do the Bath bun variation that's in the book. Now I get it. For years, I was afraid of a higher hydration dough, and it's kind of natural. But when you get into it, if you find the right level of hydration, it's really nice. So I'll put down below with this recipe the hydration that I ended up using. And I think I've said, probably a million times, if you're not using the same brand of flour from the same batch as I used in this one, you're going to have to play with your hydration level. It's just a fact of life. You're going to have to play around with it. You're going to have to find what works for you. It's a lifelong learning experience, and you have to really want to be able to do it. And you have to do it in a way that you're not afraid of failing. Because even when you fail, I would call that kind of a fail. But for the first 3 mornings, that made amazing toast. It really did make amazing toast. So I'm going to work that. I've put peel, candied peel, citrus peel, and raisins in here. So we're going to work it in to try to get them distributed throughout the dough. They will stick out one side. That'll be fine. Get it worked in. and then we'll weigh this and figure out how big to make the buns. $13.29, 1.32, 1.33. I want a dozen, 110, 100, almost 111 grams. Somewhere between 110 and 111 grams will give me 12 buns. Okay. Oh, I should probably leave this here just to check the first few and make sure that I'm doing it right. Getting there. That's only 65. Okay. There we go. Okay, so this isn't something you do every day. This isn't something I do every day. Take your time. It's going to be hard. You're going to curse yourself. You're going to want to give up. You're going to think that you failed. Just take your time, and you will come up with a bun that doesn't look too bad. It doesn't look great. But every time you do it, it's going to look better. Every time you do it, it's going to look better. And that is kind of what learning is all about. You know, people expect a lot of this stuff just to come easily because you see it on TikTok or YouTube. It doesn't always come that easily. There are times where you're going to say, this just is not working out. This bun is never going to make the shape of a bun. What am I doing? There's too much peel in this one. It's going to be a mess. It's sticky. It's sticking to my hand. It's sticking to the bench. The peel is coming out. I'm never going to get anywhere with that. Once you persevere, for everyone that turns out horrible, you get one that turns out okay. If you haven't caught on already, this channel is not about teaching perfect technique. This channel is about inspiring you to get in the kitchen and realize that all of those gatekeepers that tell you that you're doing it wrong unless you're doing it exactly perfectly right from the very beginning, you can just tell them to off. Just go and make it. Learn. Try it. It doesn't have to be perfect. It really doesn't have to be perfect. Okay, last one, and I'm going to cover these with a tea towel and let that rise for about an hour. Okay, we got a pretty good rise on these buns. Look at that. Now, the recipe does not say anything about brushing the tops with butter or putting any sugar on it. It just says to stick them in the oven, 400 degrees, 20 minutes. I know that brushing the tops with butter and putting a little bit of sugar on them will make them better. And this is something that I struggle with, because I know that for a lot of people, the idea of trying a new recipe for the first time is to do the recipe exactly as written. Fantastic policy. Absolutely fantastic policy. And then on the second go round or the third go round, start making changes once you've sort of become comfortable with it. And I think that is, you know, a great way to do things. At the same time, I get a lot of flack from people who say, you should know better, you should just know what you're doing, you should know that it's supposed to be done a certain way. And, you know, sometimes there is something to be said for that. But at the same time, if you're doing a recipe for the very first time and you've never encountered this particular dish before, you wouldn't know. Especially when this book was written and you didn't have the internet. You wouldn't know. If it wasn't part of your childhood, your family tradition, and you just looked at this recipe and said, oh, bath buns. That sounds kind of cool. I'm going to make that. You would not know in 1940 or 1950, when this book was printed, what they were actually supposed to be. And you would happily make them from the book and think, oh, it's fantastic, not knowing that there were things that were missing or not quite right. So it is kind of, it's easy for, in hindsight, to look at something, you know, and say, oh, they got it wrong because now we know. And otherwise, you know, I just don't know. So I'm going to do half. I'm going to do half the way I think with what I think would make them better. And I'm going to do half without any butter and sugar. And we're going to pop these in the oven for about 20 minutes.
Ooh, Glen, nice buns.
Hey, Jules.
Hi, friends. Hey, Glen. These, did you do a different recipe? Because these do not look like any of these versions?
No, well,
I'm curious.
same recipe. Same recipe, kind of. I mean, at every stage, I added more liquid.
So this is like,
This is probably maximum hydration that most people at home will be able to handle. Because the dough is pretty
oh,
sticky.
because it gets sticky.
It
Okay,
gets
I'm like, what does that
sticky,
mean?
Gets sticky. It gets kind of sloppy.
Okay.
So this is the side that I rubbed with that I
see
brushed
some
butter
sugar.
and added some sugar, and this side I did not. Presents a little bit nicer. Some of these buns, the shapes aren't great, but I'm not opening a bakery. This isn't a Michelin-starred
This
restaurant.
is just for me to snack on.
I'm going to eat them. Oh, they're still warm.
So I see there's some stuff inside. What else you got? I see raisins and maybe a little bit of peel.
There's-
so just stuff everything.
There's raisins and peel, although
Although it doesn't look like there's any in that one. But not in that one. So maybe in the other direction?
okay, so
Or is that the last one you rolled and you're like,
no, I just didn't get it evenly. Some of these are probably loaded.
it's nice and soft.
So right off the top, extra
soft.
extra hydration. It is a much nicer dough. Mm-hmm. Okay.
So there's no way you can say that the flavor of this dough is absolutely fabulous.
Wonderful.
As indicated by in the last day and a half,
Yeah.
we have eaten most of those, half of that, and a good chunk of that. And here we are still, the flavor is amazing.
Okay.
The texture of this version is fabulous.
As much as this is the best version of every one that I've done, if you do the recipe as written in this book, you're going to come up with this. And I'm going to tell you that in the first day or 2 days, that is better than anything you're going to buy at the grocery store,
Oh yeah,
right?
it's a great bun.
So even though it's not as good as these, it's still really good. And so if your comfort level with a yeasted dough is that you don't want it to be sticky and sloppy, and do that one, and then work your way towards the higher hydration. And when I say higher hydration, I mean 2-3 tablespoons of extra water at a time. Don't go so high that it's,
Even then, that's pretty risque. Although what I did like about this dough, is that because it's only it's not like it's just a lightly sweet dough. You added the sugar and the cinnamon. It was great. You added
So that was
the peel
that was English spice, peel, and raisins.
and raisins. Could use a little icing, but
Well, yes. This one, a couple of drops of orange essence or lemon essence would just push that right over the top.
It's a very versatile dough that way.
Yes. So it is something where you can master the dough and then use it for any sweet roll that you want. Make it, try it, work it out, start with that recipe. Know that you're going to have to vary your liquid level based on what kind of flour you're using and what kind of dough that you want to end up with. And you could end up with something fabulous no matter what you do.
There you go.
Thanks for stopping by. See you again soon.